Once, when U.S. Grant was about to take Fort Donelson, and as we recall from one of our early lectures, that was one of the first great battles that thrust U.S. Grant into the limelight, Forrest was indignant about what was taking place, and he yelled at his superiors. He said, "I didn't come here to surrender my command." So even though they were surrounded and they were about to fall, well, Forrest wasn't about to surrender, and he didn't. What he did was he led 700 troops across an icy stream that was judged way too deep for infantry to ford, and somehow, against all odds, they managed to escape. Forrest was the master of what we would call the lightning raid, and he was always invariably one step ahead of the Federals who were pursuing him. In one battle in July 1862, just to give you a sense of how great and how talented Forrest was, and how also suited he would be to something like guerrilla war, Forrest, with a force of only 2,500 men, he was able to pin down an invading army of 40,000 troops. Forrest had swashbuckling tactics. He was almost like the vintage guerrilla. He would strike at times and places of his own choosing. His cavalry did a number of things. Among them, they would capture garrisons. They destroyed railroads. They took bridges. They took depots. And they would invariably escape before the Union knew it even hit them. More often than not, while Forrest was operating in Tennessee, while he was operating in Alabama, while he was operating in Mississippi, the enemy was twice the size. But it didn't matter. Time and again, Forrest would outfight, Forrest would outmaneuver, and Forrest would outbluff Union garrisons. And in the process, he would tear up tens of miles of railroads and telegraph lines. He would inflict great casualties upon the enemy. In 1 week in 1864, again to give you a sense of how talented he was as a soldier and how fierce he was as a soldier, Forrest would strike at Sherman's supply lines with a real vengeance. He would capture 2,300 Union soldiers and seize 800 horses in just 2 weeks. Now, it doesn't mean that Forrest was perfect. It doesn't mean that everything he did was impeccable. And indeed, at one point, the Union actually did surprise him, but only once. It was at a place called Parker's Crossroad in Tennessee. This was in December 1862. What had happened is that at the time, Forrest had just made a daring raid on U.S. Grant's lines, and he was blasting his way through the Federals in front of him, when unexpectedly he was struck from behind. Now, sort of picture this in your mind. In effect, he was surrounded on one side and on the other side. Now, at that point, a panicked staff aide shouted for orders from Forrest. And Forrest shouted back, "Split in two and charge both ways." Now, of course, this order made no sense. It defied all military logic. But his men escaped anyway. That's the kind of leader that Nathan Bedford Forrest was. And no less than Bill Sherman, the great and terrifying Union general, once said, "There will never be peace in Tennessee until Nathan Bedford Forrest is dead." And boy, how the colorful, hot-headed Nathan Bedford Forrest, he just loved all this attention. And he delighted in his own exploits. He often bragged about putting a skier on the enemy. And the reason I say skier is because he had this kind of backwoods lilt to his voice, this heavy southern accent. And because he wasn't educated, he didn't always pronounce words totally properly. But he bragged about putting a skier on the enemy. He boasted about hitting him on the end. He preened about bursting hell wide open. And he also contributed his own maxim to warfighting. And this maxim would actually guide military theoreticians right up to this day and this age in warfare. What Nathan Bedford Forrest said was, "I get there firstest with the mostest." Now, did he actually say that? Well, some historians have cast doubt on it. It is certainly clear that he said something like that. Yet for all his remarkable exploits, the fact of the matter is there was one terrible black mark, one terrible stain that hung over Forrest's career. It happened in 1864. In 1864, Forrest was blamed for massacring, in cold blood, surrendering black Union soldiers at a place called Fort Pillow. The facts of the ghastly slaughter are in some doubt, and it's not clear really or completely what happened. It is said by supporters of Forrest that whatever did happen, and happened in the fury of battle. And it's also said, history is reminded, that the Unionists were literally taunting Forrest and his men, and in that sense they kind of brought on this fury that was wrought upon him. Moreover, it is also said that while some of the slaughter was taking place, it was Forrest who actually tried to stop it when he realized it was happening. But while the facts of the actual instance of Fort Pillow are in doubt, what is not in doubt is that evidence of this terrible event would further galvanize the North to stop him. Although, interestingly, when the Union cabinet convened to discuss it, Abraham Lincoln was the one voice at the cabinet saying, "We can't become hung up on this. We just have to think about ending the war." But it did sort of inspire the kind of fury and the hatred even more of the North and made them want to stop him more than ever. But even now they failed. At Bryce's Crossroads in Mississippi, Forrest then routed an 8,000-man Union force assembled by Bill Sherman. And for Bill Sherman, the great Union general, this rout was simply too much. He declared that Forrest could no longer be allowed to roam loose, and so what he did was he diverted 2 full divisions, 15,000 men, and these men were to follow Forrest to the death and to end him once and for all. While all this was happening, this Union general quipped slyly at the time. He said, "Well, they removed me from my command because I couldn't keep Forrest out of West Tennessee." And what this general almost boasted was, well, now they can't keep Forrest out of their own bathroom. It was said, in fact, that Forrest was the only cavalryman about whom U.S. Grant stood in much dread. You know, if you mentioned any other general to U.S. Grant, he barely batted an eyelash. Even with the great Robert E. Lee, the great general, the commander of the Southern forces. You know, at one point when the forces came in and went to Grant and said, "Oh, General Lee is going to do this, he's going to do that." And Grant got very angry and he said, "I don't care if General Lee is going to stand on his head. I only want to hear what we're going to do. Don't bother to tell me about General Lee." It didn't matter to him. But when Grant reportedly heard about Nathan Bedford Forrest, it was said that he would be shaken up and would get terribly anxious. But even for somebody as fierce and as talented as Nathan Bedford Forrest, by April 1865, the future was now arriving with a grim vengeance. It was clear that things were changing on the battlefield. For one thing, Forrest's men were now exhausted by not only months but really years of hard riding and fighting. And at this point, in April 1865, Forrest was now facing General James Wilson, who was a protege of U.S. Grant's. And James Wilson had now assembled the largest cavalry ever put together in North America, 13,000 battle-hardened and toughened and lean men. And the two would clash fiercely, Wilson's men against Forrest's men. Although it's interesting, at one point, Forrest and Wilson actually had their representatives meet, and when Forrest actually laid out a proposal, and he suggested that they actually settle things in a kind of duel. Of course, that didn't happen. So the two cavalries fierce clashly, and at one point, after a series of intense skirmishes, which happened over 48 straight hours, and Forrest was shouting, "For God's sake, men, rally!" It was Forrest's first defeat of the war. It was at Selma on April 2nd in April 1865. During this, Forrest's face was blackened with dirt, his body was matted with caked blood, and his sword arm was actually hacked up. You know, he later said that if the boy who he was up against knew only how to use that sword properly, he would have been dead rather than having just a hacked up arm. But while all this happened, Forrest gathered his remaining men, and he drove them through darkness and 3 days of drenching rains to scramble to safety. But even now, Forrest remained all hell for leather. So for these 3 days and nights, he continued to push his men, and he pushed them through rain, he pushed them through thunder, he pushed them through wood, he pushed them through the backwoods, and in the process, he came across another Union cavalry detachment en route, and he slaughtered them as well. And once he got to the backwoods, by the lines of Alabama and Mississippi, he decided he would regroup and plot his next moves. And it was, of course, around this time that Nathan Bedford Forrest learned about Lincoln's assassination. Now, as this conflict continued, as it reached its precipitous point, as things got even tougher, it seems remarkably, and almost paradoxically, Forrest's courage only enlarged as well, because Nathan Bedford Forrest was driven by a single-minded pursuit of battle. Now, if there were a guerrilla campaign waged, nobody would have been more suited to it than he. But the question is would he make that adjustment? Would he do it? Well, from the field in mid-April of 1865, we know that Forrest looked like anything but a man who was ready to quit. Let's look, for example, at just what he'd been doing in just the last few weeks alone. During these last few weeks, Forrest had been a whirlwind of activity. He had been commanding his men to be ready. He had been telling them there was not a moment to lose. In fact, at one point, he actually had a man and his boy executed for desertion, and he prominently put them on a well-traveled Confederate road with a huge sign prominently hung from them that said, "Shot for desertion." And it was also clear that Nathan Bedford Forrest relished more fight. As late as April 25th, he was telling men to be ready to do their duty. But at this point, let's look at the larger context in which Forrest was operating. Clearly now, at this point, to a great extent, Forrest was operating in an information vacuum. Because unlike the North, and we discussed this in a previous lecture, where news immediately traveled over a web of telegraph wires and quickly found its way into the next day's newspapers, in the Confederacy, or at least much of it, it was a wasteland. Thousands of miles of telegraph wires and railroad tracks had been torn up by the Union. And the result of all this was that the Confederacy was now awash in gossip, and it was awash in rumor, but there was little hard fact. It often took people many weeks and sometimes months to get real details about what was taking place. So at this point, in late April, Forrest did know that Abraham Lincoln was dead, but he actually had conflicting reports about whether Robert E. Lee had actually surrendered. He also believed that U.S. Grant had lost some 100,000 men to desertion. Now, interestingly enough, this figure was not far off the mark, but what was far off the mark was the extent of time over which the desertions took, and what Forrest didn't know was that Grant was able to replenish these men with fresh soldiers, with fresh troops. So the desertions didn't really matter. Now, as to taking to the hills, actually Forrest's strategy at this point was to wait and see. He wanted to decide what to do next as more information trickled in. So he told his men to resist the sensational rumors, and he counseled them that a few more days will determine the truth of reports now in circulation about what had happened after Lincoln's death, what was Robert E. Lee doing. Meanwhile, the fact of the matter was that throughout the South, and for others in the North who supported the South, they were looking to Nathan Bedford Forrest for the purposes of just what Abraham Lincoln feared more than anything else, for a prolonged guerrilla campaign. In fact, the prominent Baltimore journalist, William Wilkins Glenn, what he put in his diary was, he said, Forrest as genius. He said Forrest as popularity and power. And what he hoped was that Forrest and Joe Johnston's army, that was the army, I can remind you, which Robert E. Lee was going to hook up with in North Carolina, he hoped that Forrest and Johnston, and that they would fall back to Texas with an army of some 50,000 men, and he believed that with grass for horses and mountain range for defense, he believed that these two could work miracles. But before miracles could be worked, Nathan Bedford Forrest was now waiting for definitive news of Lee and Grant. And just as much, he was waiting to hear about the outcome of discussions taking place between the Confederate General Joe Johnston and Bill Sherman. And as now Bill Sherman, the other volatile one, the other dreaded one, the other progenitor of total and terrible war that we want to turn to, Bill Sherman, the great Union general. Because indeed, if the South had its Nathan Bedford Forrest, the North had its equivalent, Bill Sherman. It was Bill Sherman alone, the Union general alone in this war, who grasped the true meaning of the maelstrom of total war. Sherman's views were this. He believed that the enemy should be hit and hit hard. He believed that you should target not just the enemy's opposing armies, but that you should oppose the enemy's industrial potential and the enemy's opposition population as well that would lie at the heart of the enemy itself. And Sherman believed further that all this entailed no more and no more less in warfare than the outright demoralization and devastation of the enemy. And he believed further, and lastly, that what you should do with the enemy is bring about the outright specter of their literal extinction. And of course, all this meant attacking not just brigades, but for Sherman it meant attacking villages. It meant for Sherman attacking not just rebel armies, but also the rebel cities themselves. Creating not just outright death, for Sherman it meant, but also creating long lines of starving refugees. This was terror every bit as much as warfare. It was scorched earth policies designed to bring the enemy to its knees. Now, of course, this awesome strategy of Bill Sherman's was then, and remains today, controversial. And it's often seen as violating all the rules of war. Certainly would be today. But Bill Sherman was always unapologetic. He blasted at one point, war is hell, and you cannot refine it. What else do we know about Bill Sherman? Who was he? Well, we know that he was edgy. We know that he was ill-tempered. We know that he cared little for social decorum. His clothes were frequently rumpled, and his manners were even worse. And this great soldier actually had asthma, although that's hard for us to believe that he could be sickly at all. And behind all this facade of being rumpled and having bad manners and being edgy and ill-tempered, the fact of the matter was there was sheer iron. He talked rapidly in a high voice, and he talked about anything under the sun. Sherman was brilliant, and he was filled with grand ideas. But beyond being brilliant, he was also meticulous in detail. Now that's a rare combination, to be brilliant about big ideas, but to pay attention to the small details. And Sherman always had an act for being on the cutting edge. He had been a banker at one point and was successful. He had been an investment broker, and he had been a lawyer. He actually wrote one of the first official memorandums about the California Gold Rush. You know, as we talk about Sherman, I should also tell you that he is one of the greatest and most fascinating characters of the war, and for that matter, he's one of my favorites. Now, Sherman was also, we can see, that he was the foster child of a prominent U.S. Senator, Thomas Ewing, and he would later marry his foster sister. Now, when that happened, his foster parents, they at first blushed. They were aghast. They said, my God, he can't do that. But then they realized, well, it's all right. Now, among the guests at Sherman's wedding were none other than President Taylor, senatorial giants like Daniel Webster and Henry Clay. Because the fact of the matter is because his father was a prominent U.S. Senator, and also Bill Sherman's brother would be a U.S. Senator as well, he was literally among political royalty in a sense. Now, though Sherman came from Ohio, the fact of the matter is Bill Sherman also loved the South. You know, when the war started, the South actually offered Sherman a commission, not unlike Lee was offered a commission by the North. But more than that, more than he loved the South, the fact of the matter is even more so, is Sherman loved the Union more than anything else. Now, he almost didn't make it in the war. And when the war started, the fact of the matter is unlike most West Pointers, he had no military experience because he had not fought in the Mexican War. But nonetheless, at the first great battle of the war at Manassas or Bull Run, Bill Sherman acquitted himself well. And he acquitted himself even better at Shiloh. And after that, for the rest of the war, Bill Sherman was invariably and inevitably at U.S. Grant's side, in one manner or another. When Grant finally became Commander-in-Chief in 1864, he made Sherman his commander of the Western forces, and this was a wise choice by Grant. The greatest military turning point of this war was probably in 1864. It was at that point, when Grant had been pummeled in battle after battle in the wilderness, and he had now settled down to a maddening siege against Robert E. Lee. It was at that point where the Northern Peace Movement was at its high point and gaining steam. It was at that point when George McClellan, the first General-in-Chief of the Union, was running against Abraham Lincoln for the presidency, and it was believed that he would win. That, in fact, is what Abraham Lincoln believed. And it was at that point where Bill Sherman himself looked as though he had stalled. The people began to ask at that point in the Union, why don't Grant and Sherman do something? Well, Grant was bogged down in a siege, but Sherman did do something quite radical. Sherman decided he would ignore the enemy army altogether, and he would instead take this war and savage the spirit of the South. And a daring move, to stress how daring it is, I can't even underscore it enough in this lecture. But you have to take my word on it. He abandoned his supply lines, and Sherman led his 62,000 men to Atlanta. And from there, he would go to Savannah and then to the sea. Now, what he did was he actually, by cutting himself off from his supply lines, he put his own army at risk. And for some days, he was actually out of contact with the Union Army in totality. And while this happened, Abraham Lincoln was just morbid with fear. He was just shuddering with anxiety. But nonetheless, Sherman was confident of what he was doing. What he said he would do was, he said he would make his march to Georgia, and he would make Georgia howl. He said, I will cut a swath to the sea, and I will cut the Confederacy in two. And as it turned out, Sherman's juggernaut of a war machine would be literally almost unstoppable, and would be ruthless. When he took Atlanta on September 2nd, his soldiers would torch everything of military value, and they would torch much of everything that wasn't of military value. They ransacked the city, and they would batter Atlanta beyond recognition. Long lines of innocent civilians would end up fleeing the city, more than 1,500 non-combatants as well. And when Sherman's legions finally left Atlanta and embarked towards the seacoast, Atlanta lay behind, a smoldering ruin. Well, the South got the message. Mary Chestnut said in her diary, since Atlanta, I have felt as if all were dead within me, forever. We are being wiped off the face of the earth. But Sherman was unrepentant about all this, and he was unrepentant about the calls about what he was doing, violated all the rules of war. What he said was, Atlanta is ours and fairly won. And he also said to his critics, he said, we must make these people feel the hard hand of war. And he added one of the most memorable lines of all in military history. He said, war is cruelty, and you cannot refine it. Well, after taking Atlanta, what did he then do? Well, then we see him laying waste to a 285-mile corridor in which he left a cloud of destruction and plunder in his wake. And then in December, he would send a jaunty wire to Abraham Lincoln. I beg to present you a Christmas gift, he said, the city of Savannah. And then after that, he continued his fearsome march. He would continue and commence with his most fearsome effort yet, his march on Columbia, South Carolina, 425 miles away. Sherman noted at the time that his whole army was burning with an insatiable desire to wreak vengeance upon South Carolina. And he said, I almost tremble at her fate. And well, he should have, because the destruction that he would inflict would be far more intense and far more comprehensive than even in Georgia. He would lay a path of ruin that would literally stretch hundreds of miles long. In effect, this was no longer war, but this would be with sheer vengeance. This was no matter to Bill Sherman, because the South got the message too. Said Confederate Joe Johnston at the time when he heard what Bill Sherman was doing, he said, well, when I learned that Sherman's army was marching at a rate of 12 miles a day through the swamps, he said, I made up my mind that there had been no such army in existence since Julius Caesar. Yet even Julius Caesar himself may have wept at what happened next by Bill Sherman. The destruction of Columbia, South Carolina, the capital of the state, was near total, because for the Union they had decided this is where the rebellion had begun and this is where it would end. Well, this may seem what Sherman had done to be a hard species of war, but Sherman explained that it was the only way to bring home the sad realities of war and to get the South to stop. And it did indeed bring home the sad realities of the war. Sherman's goal all along the way was to sap the very will of the Southerners to fight, to devastate not just their forces but their farms and their cities and their factories and their very people. He had resolved that even if he couldn't change the hearts of the people of the South, he could at least make war so terrible and make them so sick of war that generations would pass away before they would again resort to war. Yet 2 weeks later, after this, when Sherman now made his way into North Carolina, all of a sudden, the looting and the burning ended. Now, why is that so? Why did all of a sudden Sherman change so dramatically? Well, Sherman remembered quite crisply, quite clearly, what Abraham Lincoln said to him at City Point when the month was about to begin, when Lincoln talked about how there has to be a tender peace and a soft peace. So at this point, Sherman was now looking forward to wrapping up the end of the war, so he would change his tactics. At this juncture, there were now a number of sharp little clashes at Aversboro and Bentonville, and at this point the dilapidated rebels fought bravely. But nonetheless, ironically, Sherman went out of his way to limit the conflict. Why did he do that? Well, because, as it turned out, Sherman's own soldiers, these lean, hardened men of the West, they themselves were exhausted from the months of fighting. And as it also turned out, Sherman's own men dreaded, and I quote here, they dreaded the thought of chasing Johnston's army out into the West and into the Deep South. And they themselves were also ready for peace, and they were ready for peace on almost any terms. And finally, Sherman's men, too, were sick of war at this juncture. And moreover, there's one other point that we need to understand about Bill Sherman. Contrary to the myth, Sherman actually had a little taste for direct combat. He didn't like direct combat. What he always preferred was maneuver. It would be unthinkable to think of Sherman dispatching his men as Lee did at Pickett's charge at Gettysburg, or Sherman dispatching his men as Grant did at Cold Harbor. Always, Bill Sherman preferred maneuver warfare. And in fact, he derided direct conflict as all moonshine. And in fact, Sherman himself, even at this late juncture, in April 1865, he remained a riddle of fears at this late stage, and his morbid concern, more than anything else, was of anarchy breaking out all over the land, because he knew, far more than the rest of the world knew, that the Union was broke. He knew that for all the glory, the mighty Northern Army Armada at this point was exhausted, and he also knew that the South itself was a near wasteland, and much of it was in peril, literally, of starving, and that was a problem as well. And it was against this great troubled backdrop that Bill Sherman, more than anything else, feared that Joe Johnston would take his army of 25,000 men into the mountains, and as he put it, break his army up into small bands and prolong the war indefinitely. This was what Bill Sherman knew the Spaniards had done to Napoleon, and he had a little stomach for it happening here in the United States. In fact, he wrote a communique to the Union Chief of Staff expressing his concerns that the Southerners would break up into small bands and they would be facing a situation not unlike what Napoleon faced with the Spaniards. So it is little wonder, in light of all this, that on April 14th, when Bill Sherman received a communique from Joe Johnston, he could scarcely contain his delight when his communique asked that the two of them would meet to discuss terms of exterminating the war. And remember, April 14th was the day Abraham Lincoln was shot. But like so much else in these remarkable final days, in this remarkable stage of the end of this war, this surrender would experience its own turmoil as well. And that is what we'll turn to in our next lecture.
After listening to Lecture 11, a student posed this question to Professor Winik. Why was Nathan Bedford Forrest such an effective soldier? Let's listen to the professor's response.
Nathan Bedford Forrest is one of those kind of rough and fascinating characters about whom people love to talk endlessly. I mean, he is just so fascinating and so interesting. On one hand, of course, and we mentioned this in our lecture, and how there was always that stain of what happened at Fort Pillow when they massacred black Union soldiers in cold blood, and that would always hang over him a little bit. But what's important from our point of view, and what most people really think about with Forrest, is how just fierce and how talented he was in the battlefield. And I think what made him so good is he just had the real instincts for it. He instinctively knew when you could go to battle and when you couldn't. He was very good at sort of husbanding the energy of his men. He knew when to strike and he knew when to hold back. He was also very good at using psychological warfare at the enemy. And, as I mentioned in the lecture, that if there's one name and one name only in which U.S. Grant stood in some dread of or would get anxious when he heard that name, it wasn't Robert E. Lee. It was actually, or so it is said, Nathan Bedford Forrest. Forrest knew how to play upon and to exploit the weaknesses of his enemies, and he engaged in psychological warfare. And it's for reasons like that great Union General Bill Sherman once said, "That man is the devil, and we must capture him and kill him, even if it bankrupts the U.S. Treasury." And finally, if you think in life, people just seem to be good at certain things. They may be good at acting, they may be good at writing, they may be good at sports, they may be good at teaching, or they may be good in science. Well, for whatever reason, Nathan Bedford Forrest had a real gift in war. And the one other thing that we can say about Forrest is he was one of those real rare commanders, although we tended to see more of them in the South than we have in most armies throughout history, is he was absolutely fearless. He was not afraid of dying. He had 30 horses shot out from underneath him. He killed more than 30 men, or at least 30 men, with his own bare hands in warfare. He wasn't afraid of sort of going into battle, and whatever may be, may be. And I think it was precisely that fearlessness which he would impart to his men, and he galvanized them, as a sense. They were willing to follow their leader because they saw that he himself was ready to die for the cause in which they were engaged.
This ends Lecture 11. A House Reunited, Lecture 12. The Surrender Continues.
In our last lecture, we saw the volatility of the situation after Lincoln's assassination. There were still 3 rebel armies in the field, with Joe Johnston being the principal general still out there. The Union was financially broke, and the Northern armies were weary of more war, even Bill Sherman's army. There was Nathan Bedford Forrest, the great Southern cavalryman, exhorting his men for more war, and he was waiting for word as to what to do next. And there was Bill Sherman, the great Union general, who had cut a swath to the sea and had made the South tremble. Well, even he was tired of more war. And there was the new Union government, now deprived of the wise guiding hand of Lincoln's leadership. Well, what we'll talk about in this lecture is how things start to begin to resolve themselves. And we can think of this lecture as being about the surrender. And as I also mentioned in our last lecture, on April 17th, Bill Sherman and Joe Johnston met for the first time. This was in response to the communique that Johnston had sent to Bill Sherman. Unlike at Appomattox, which was filled with such grandeur around it, the two generals this time retired to a small ramshackle house belonging to a local farmer. It's called the Bennett House. And in fact, the Bennett House is still there, and you can also see that today as well. Now, this was not a formal surrender, but soon enough it would develop into an intricate dialogue that would go on again, off again, for a full 10.5 days. So when Sherman and Johnston first met, Sherman actually thrust the cable with the news of Lincoln's death into Johnston's hands, and he commented at the time that it was bad news. Johnston looked at the note, and he agreed, saying, "Great God, this was the worst possible calamity for the South." In fact, when Johnston got this note, he was shaking, and blots of perspiration were on his forehead, and Sherman right away could see his concern. And Sherman could see that Johnston was being totally on a line with him and saying this was the worst possible calamity for the South, and that they had no involvement in it. So even after Johnston denied any Confederate involvement, he then went on to denounce it in the strongest possible terms. So having settled that, Sherman and Johnston then got down to the business of what would happen next. And far from coming to surrender, it turned out that Johnston had an even grander idea in mind. He had an idea that the two men, that he sitting down with Bill Sherman, could, as he put it, make one job of it, and that it could actually make the surrender universal. In other words, that right there, in that small little ramshackle house, the Bennett House, that they could end this war once and for all. Now, they decided that they would meet again the next day, and this time it was decided that they would be joined by John Breckinridge. And Breckinridge was not only the former Vice President of the United States, but he was also the Confederate Secretary of War, and as well, he was a general in the Southern Army. Now, at first, when it was proposed that John Breckinridge join them, because what had happened is Sherman said, to Johnston, he said, "Is your power even broad enough to bring this war to an end?" And he said, "Well, it could be if I were to have John Breckinridge here." And Sherman said, "Well, I won't meet with Breckinridge because I won't meet with the Confederate Secretary of War. I can't do that in a political setting because I'm a military general." And at that juncture, Johnston reminded him, Breckinridge was also a general in the Southern Army, so on that basis, they would all meet. So the next day, Johnston and Breckinridge and Sherman sat down, and they got down to business. And for starters, they all agreed that slavery was dead. Well, that was a good start. And then at one point, they actually shared a drink of whiskey. In fact, there's a little bit of gallows humor in there when after the meeting, Breckinridge would actually complain that Sherman had a second drink, and he said, "And did you see, he didn't even offer me another drink. He was a hog, sir, yes, a real hog." But then they got down to business. Finally, Bill Sherman grabbed a piece of paper, and he decided he would write out the terms for surrender. Now, in the back of his mind, and this is very important for us to think about, was that original meeting that Sherman and Grant had with Lincoln when they met at City Point before April 1865 began. And that was the meeting in which Lincoln had called for a tender of peace. And also rattling around in the back of Sherman's mind was what he feared so much, what he feared so terribly, and that was the beast of anarchy and chaos. And as he also wrote to the Army Chief of Staff, that dread of the possibility that the rebel armies would break up into guerrilla bands. So Sherman sat for a time, and he scribbled, and at one point he just kind of looked out of the window almost absent-mindedly. But finally, he finished his terms, and he pushed them away, and he looked over to Breckinridge and Johnston, and he sighed, "That's the best I can do." But as it turned out, he did more than plenty, and the terms were anything but simple. The upshot was that these terms offered a basis to end the war across the board, and in doing so they would, of course, thereby preempt any kind of a guerrilla conflict. The terms, however, Sherman made clear were conditional, subject to the approval of civilian authorities on both sides. So as dusk gathered, and Sherman and Johnston left the Bennett House negotiations, they left thinking that they'd actually ended the war, that the twin beasts of chaos and revenge would be strangled in their crib. But little did they know as they were riding off thinking that they had ended the war, that soon enough all hell was about to break loose once again. And the hell that broke loose was in Washington. Now, why did this happen? Well, it happened because when the new president and the Union cabinet received the terms that had been written out by Sherman to the Southerners, Andrew Johnson, the new president, was livid. Why? To Johnson, he felt that Sherman had way overstepped his bounds. Johnson believed that no military man had the right to decide such matters, that it had to be done only by the politicians and only by the president and his advisors. Also to Andrew Johnson, he felt that the generous terms that Sherman had written to the Southerners smacked of being way too generous, and he also felt that they looked as though the war would end almost as though it had never been waged. For example, there was a provision in which it was said that munitions would be stacked in rebel capitals, and Johnson worried that if that were to happen, the rebellion could start all over again, and they would be freshly stocked with these weapons as a result. Also, very little was done about the freedman, about the former slaves, and so in bases such as these, everything was just nullified in the mind of Johnson and his cabinet. And yet, as furious as Johnson was, and Andrew Johnson was furious, it turned out the Union cabinet was even more enraged. Both Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War, and the Attorney General James Speed, they actually believed that Sherman was now preparing to march north, to institute a military coup, reminiscent of the European intrigues carried out by Napoleon. In fact, the Attorney General actually worried that Sherman had immediate designs in the government, and that he was plotting to make himself a dictator. And here I actually quote him directly. And it was decided as a result of all that by the Union cabinet that they would get U.S. Grant, the General-in-Chief, who would undertake a secret mission to go and talk to Sherman and talk some sense to him. But even here, the cabinet had their worries, because they worried, if you can believe this, and again, it's very hard for us to believe all this, but if you think of the scent of conspiracy and the turmoil and the chaos rippling through the Union, only then does it become much more intelligible. But they worried if Grant went down there, Sherman might arrest him. Such was the tenor of these late April days that was rippling through after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. Soon, U.S. Grant would leave under a cover of darkness. It would take him 2 days to meet with Bill Sherman. He would finally meet up with him on April 24th. And by that point, when he met with Sherman, Sherman was just fuming. Sherman had been pacing up and down the room of his command post, really like a caged lion. He was fuming against the politicians. He was fuming against the senators. And of course, let's not forget, even as he railed against senators, Sherman's foster father was a prominent U.S. senator, and for that matter, his brother was currently a U.S. senator. But of all people, it turned out U.S. Grant was just the right man to handle Bill Sherman. Bill Sherman had once remarked of his old friend, he said, "Grant stood by me when I was crazy. I stood by him when he was drunk, and now we stand by each other always." As the meeting progressed, Grant handled the matter with a remarkably deft touch. It was as brilliant as what he did at Appomattox. and Bill Sherman responded accordingly. Now, all this is not to say that Sherman wasn't without his own worries still. Nor should we forget, as well, that Sherman was one of the most prescient men in the entirety of the war, on either side of the Mason-Dixon line. You know, it's interesting. When the war first began, and Lincoln called up enough men for only a 3-month skirmish, it was Bill Sherman, of all people, who wagged an angry finger and said, "No, this war will go on for many, many years, and there will be many tears, blood shed," and for that the press called him crazy in the Union. Well, now what was Bill Sherman thinking? Well, though Sherman was confident that the war was nearly over, Sherman, as he put it at the time, he said he felt sick and powerless over the course of events after Lincoln's assassination. He said that watching the disorderly events in the Capitol, he wondered who was now there to give shape and order to the now disjointed elements of the leaderless, now headless government. And as the uneasy stalemate that he had now with Johnston was about to crumble, Sherman also openly feared that events were drifting further into another civil war, that events were drifting further into another anarchical war. So what happened now, we can ask? Well, under the strict orders of Andrew Johnson and Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War, and under the watchful eye of U.S. Grant looking over his shoulder, Bill Sherman would give Joe Johnston a blunt new ultimatum. It was said that hostilities would resume in 48 hours, unless Johnston surrendered before that time on precisely the same terms that were given to General Lee at Appomattox. In other words, given all this, Bill Sherman now had little choice but to be poised for one last terrible march of death, if not for weeks and months of lingering pursuit of the rebels who had taken to the steep rugged mountains of Georgia and beyond. And we can add further that U.S. Grant was now taking no chances. Without telling Sherman about this, and that's a remarkable event in and of itself, Grant decided that he would order General Sheridan with his cavalry and an infantry corps to move towards North Carolina as soon as possible. So in light of all this now, what was happening on the Confederate side? What was taking place here? Well, here, even here, the mix was equally volatile. The Union had promptly vetoed the Bennett House Agreement. Confederate President Jefferson Davis had actually approved of it. And you may say that's strange. Why would he approve of it when Davis was one of these bitter enders? Well, it turns out that Davis approved of the Bennett House Accords largely because he had anticipated, and quite correctly, the North would never approve of it. In this way, he would look like he gets credit for being for peace and let the North sort of undo it all. So at this time, cradling Sherman's most recent demand, Johnston actually wired back to Jefferson Davis for further guidance. He wired, "Have you instructions?" And when he eventually received his reply, came the words that Joe Johnston had dreaded more than anything else. Back came the reply from the Confederate President and the Confederate Cabinet, "Retreat and fight on." Imagine those words ringing like a klaxon in Joe Johnston's head. Retreat and fight on, fight on, fight on. Johnston was told to take as many of his some 25,000 men and to fall back to Georgia with as much of his cavalry and as much of his infantry and his heavy weapons as possible. In short, what Lee had said no to at Appomattox, Jefferson Davis, the Confederate president, was now ordering Joe Johnston to make come to pass. A guerrilla campaign or something akin to that. In fact, around this time, the London Times, the prominent paper in London, one of the oldest papers in the modern world, had already warned of what they called the Armageddon that now seemed to be approaching. Suddenly, the specter that Bill Sherman had wanted to avoid more than anything else now seemed to be coming to pass. Joe Johnston's men taking to the hills. And meanwhile, let's not forget, as we have talked about in previous lectures, there were still 3 battle-hardened rebel armies out there, their murderous gun barrels hot to the bitter end. There was still Nathan Bedford Forrest, about whom we've already talked about at great length, who would be so poised to carry out a guerrilla campaign from the woods. And there is Richard Taylor, the general. And there is Kirby Smith in the West. In fact, in the West, it was called Kirby Smithdom because he ruled it by himself. And all these along with Davis and Johnston. And remember, these generals controlled upwards to at least 175,000 men, still united by a flickering national spirit. And, until given the order, these men refused to become little more than a disorderly mob of refugees in their own country. And in fact, what we also have to recall, very important for this discussion in this lecture, is even now, many citizens of the Confederate States of America had hardly given up. In fact, as one Southern lady had put it in mid-April, she said, "What is it that sustains me? Well, what sustains me is faith in the country. What sustains me is faith in the cause. What sustains me is an earnest belief that eventually we will yet conquer." Well, to be sure, the South at this late date wasn't going to conquer, But the tinder was there, waiting a spark. The reconciliation could still go terribly, terribly awry, which Abraham Lincoln had so desperately feared. And even now, the maddening cacophony of war continued. The maddening hell of war continued, as small but deadly skirmishes were taking place all across the South, in places like Munford Station, Alabama, in places like Hendersonville, North Carolina, and in places such as in Kansas by Fort Zarah, and all across the rest of the South. And at this juncture, terrible questions now hung over the nation as the negotiations between Johnston and Sherman seemed to be breaking down. What if Robert E. Lee, the vaunted Southern commander, now safely back at his home in 707 Franklin Street in Richmond, Virginia, what if he had been of the same turn of mind as, say, in our own day and age, an Osama bin Laden, or a Milosevic, or a Yasser Arafat? You can bet that he, with a wink and a nod, would have said, well, now is maybe the time to give a little bit of guerrilla warfare a chance. Now is the time for us to give it a shot. Or alternatively, we could ask, or would the country now devolve into bloodshed and chaos and further civil strife? The Balkan scenario, the Northern Ireland scenario, the Middle East type scenario, the very sort of scenario that Abraham Lincoln so feared with every fiber of his body, and yet his now wise leadership was gone because Abraham Lincoln was now dead. Or finally, we can ask, would the country now devolve into the French Revolution scenario of more civil war, more barbarism, more hatred, and more revenge? The very sort of scenario that Lincoln feared so much with every fiber of his body, and yet his wise guiding leadership was no longer there because he was now dead. In short, at this point we have to ask, how would things suddenly resolve themselves? Well, it's an important question for us to look at, and it has to do with reconciliation. It has to do with bringing us to the heart of how the surrender would eventually take place and the war would resolve itself. It was at this point that a handful of men would step onto the stage and they would tip the balance away from war, away from harshness, away from revenge, towards peace and towards reconciliation. Foremost, it begins, almost ironically, almost curiously, with Robert E. Lee. Now let's not forget about Lee at this point. Lee at this point was a man living in limbo. He was essentially stateless. He was a little more than a paroled prisoner of war, living in occupied territory that was no longer the Confederate capital, but was not quite yet a Union state. And beyond the heartache of the war and the heartbreak of his defeat of his own proud army, Lee's own familial possessions had been ransacked by the Union. The great family of state at Arlington, belonging to his wife and kept as a shrine to George Washington, well, that had now been converted by the Union into a national cemetery of the dead. Of course, it is now the great Arlington National Cemetery, which is a cemetery for our nation. But for Robert E. Lee, that was a great humiliation. And another family estate had been torched, and for Robert E. Lee, that had been a great humiliation. And for a third, it had been savaged as well. And of course, for that was a source of great humiliation. But for all of this, almost remarkably, we can see that Robert E. Lee never revealed any bitterness. If there was any hardening of his heart, he never showed it. But what else was happening with Lee at the time? We do know that he was depressed and that he was sleeping late and often. We can also fairly comfortably surmise that he was broken-hearted. Think of it. The sight of the Confederate capital that Robert E. Lee so loved, burned and destroyed as it was, must have wrenched his soul. The shambles, the refugees, the beggars, the scorched brick skeletons that hovered over the rubble-filled streets, all this must have terribly pained Lee, who was both a passionate man and a passionate nationalist. The fact was, at this juncture, and this was something that U.S. Grant had recognized earlier, as well as Abraham Lincoln, the slightest word from Robert E. Lee, even a small veiled hint that could be misconstrued, could have done so much to reignite Southern passions, and he could have done so much to breathe new life into the remaining Southern forces still at war. Had Lee only given a word, or only given a sign, or even just a wink and a nod, it would have been that simple. He could have unearthed the deadly guerrilla struggle. At a minimum, it would have certainly meant unleashing organized chaos, and it certainly would have meant legitimizing ongoing discord that could have rippled through the Union not only for decades, but for generations. As one of Lee's colonels once said to him, "You've only to blow the bugle." At this juncture, all of the Confederacy was now looking to Robert E. Lee for guidance. In fact, to give you a sense of the enormous sway over the country that Robert E. Lee held, let me give you a small vignette from near the end of the war. Near the end of the war, in the final week before Lee surrendered his army at Appomattox, he met up with Henry Wise. Henry Wise was a former governor of Virginia, and he was also a general in the Southern armies. And he had just ridden through the still porous northern lines to meet up with Lee and discuss what was to happen next in this war. And finally, in their discussion, their words turned around to discussing, well, what about the possibility of surrender? And Lee looked over to Wise and he said, well, surrender? He said, what would the country think? And Wise looked at him and he said, the country, man, you are the country to these men. So that gives us a sense of just how prominent and how pronounced and how much sway Robert E. Lee had over the South at this point. So what did Lee do? Well, he resisted the temptation to call on the Confederacy to take advantage of the Union's temporary disarray. And he resisted the temptation to tell them to somehow press the chaos of the North to his advantage. In fact, Robert E. Lee had decided that he would go in the exact opposite direction. He decided he would now go in a direction of peace. And it was around this time that we would learn that Lee would do several remarkable things. The first remarkable thing we are told, or we learn from history, is what he would do near the month's end. At that point, he would send a letter to Jefferson Davis. Now remember, at this juncture, Lee had already sent a formal report of his final operations, his final losses, and his final surrender. He had given all the details to Jefferson Davis. Also remember, he is no longer a general of anything. He no longer commands any men, and he no longer had any real responsibility to send yet another letter to Davis. But Lee, who was always a keen student of public opinion, in fact, every day during the war, he would rise up and he would read the northern newspapers because he wanted to get a sense of how he could shape the course of events further by playing to public opinion. Even his great strike up into Gettysburg, where he was hoping to sort of end the war once and for all with one grand climatic battle on northern soil, what he was doing was he was playing to the northern peace movements that were then so rampant. What Lee did now was he sent a letter to Jefferson Davis because he wanted to set a tone for what was to happen next. And in this letter, he took dead aim at Jefferson Davis's proposed new phase of warfare. In other words, his proposed new phase of guerrilla warfare. And in his letter, Lee said no to guerrilla warfare. He told Davis it must not be fought, it probably couldn't be won, and it should not be waged. We also learn around this time that Lee did something else quite important, even quite remarkable, we can say. He would give an interview around this time to a journalist. Not a Southern journalist, as one might expect from a good Southern nationalist like Robert E. Lee, but to a Northern journalist, to Thomas Cook of the New York Herald. And of course, in doing so, it was quite clear that Lee wanted the widest possible audience for his words. He wanted to speak to the South, but he also wanted to speak to the North. And in more than one way, we learned that this interview was really quite extraordinary. In this interview, Lee condemned the assassination of Abraham Lincoln in the harshest of terms. He called it execrable and deplorable, and said it was the worst of all measures. Also, he did something else quite remarkable, we're told in this interview. We're told this by Thomas Cook. In the interview, Lee celebrated the end of slavery. He said that the best men of the South had long wanted to do away with this institution. But most astonishing for this interview, we also learned from Thomas Cook, is what Robert E. Lee did next. And what he did next was talk about what we in the country are to do next. Now, I want you to think about this for a moment. Why is that so crucial? Because just days before, whenever Lee said we in this country, he always meant the South. And just days before, whenever Lee said the country, he always meant the Confederacy. And yet now, Robert E. Lee was freely speaking as a citizen of the United States, and he was calling on all other Southerners to become good citizens of the United States. And in an interesting little historical footnote, and this is quite almost poignant in a sense, it turns out Lee would not become a citizen of the United States in the 5 short-lived years left of his life, nor would he become a citizen for another 100 years thereafter. Eventually, Congress would confer upon him that citizenship, but a century later. Lee would also promise, and this too is most important in the same interview, he said he would make any sacrifice, he would perform any honorable act that would tend to help create and foster the restoration of peace. And there is one other thing that we should look at that Lee said around this time, and this too is terribly important for us to think about in this lecture. Lee would also say, I surrendered as much to Abraham Lincoln's goodness as I did to Grant's armies. Now, to be sure, as we've seen, he surrendered to Grant's armies and to Bill Sherman's armies. But he was also saying, I surrendered as much to Lincoln's goodness. and that was clearly shaping what he was doing as well. And there we see that Lincoln's idea of a magnanimous peace as a tender peace would really have a great impact. Now, this did not mean it all was well, because there were still problems that had to be resolved. Because on the run, Jefferson Davis, the Confederate president, he would choose to ignore Lee's words. He would choose to become a bitter ender. But not so, as it turns out, with the other remaining military men in the battlefield, the men who would matter just as much, the Confederate generals who were still out there. Most prominent of these was Joe Johnston, who we were talking about in our previous lectures. Well, on April 25th, he had been told to retreat and continue the struggle, to retreat and fight on, retreat and fight on. Hearing of this, of course, Mary Chestnut at the time was buoyed. She wrote, and I'm going to quote her directly because it's a very rich and evocative language. She said, "Joe Johnston will not be caught as Lee was. He can retreat. That is his trade." Thoughts turned to Texas. You remember Davy Crockett's farewell to the Democratic Party. Crockett said, "You are going to the devil. I am going to Texas." But as it turns out, Joe Johnston wasn't going to Texas, or he wasn't going to Georgia, or to North Carolina, or anywhere else. Ignoring his president's orders, defying them actually, he instead followed Robert E. Lee's example, and he contacted Bill Sherman to meet once more time. What we see is that, with falling rocks, avalanches begin. On April 26th, thus would begin the avalanche of surrender. Sherman and Johnston would meet to conclude the surrender. It may have lacked the fanfare and pomp of Appomattox in this ramshackle house, but it was no less dignified or magnanimous. In fact, at one point, for the surrender, Sherman would actually reverse the order of the names so that Joe Johnston's name would go first. It's one small little act, one small little gesture that would be a kind of token of respect for the Southerners. And in turn, Joe Johnston would respond to Sherman's gestures, and he would tell his own men, "It is now time to restore tranquility to our country." And of course, in doing so, he would be echoing the words of Robert E. Lee. Our country. In bits and pieces, this phrase was now slowly becoming to mean North and South, one and the same. And by now, the combined impact of Lee's and Johnston's surrenders were having quite a profound effect. As word spread, remaining individual commanders would soon follow suit of what Robert E. Lee, of what the first path that he paved, and then the path that was further paved by Joe Johnston. General Richard Taylor, the son of the President Zachary Taylor, and of course Richard Taylor is one of the best generals for the South, and he would also become a fantastic diarist and chronicler of the war, and I encourage you to read his book if you can. Well, he surrendered to Edward Canby in Alabama. They actually had an al fresco lunch, a lunch outside, and at one point the band struck up Hail Columbia, and Canby, the Union general, hastily ordered, no, make a quick switch to Dixie. But at that point, Richard Taylor said, the Southerner said, no, play Hail Columbia. It shows that they were getting along even at that point. And sounding much like Lee and Johnston before him, Taylor called on his men to now surrender and to meet their responsibilities, not simply as soldiers, but just as importantly, as good citizens. And Kirby Smith also surrendered in much the same terms. And even John Mosby, that fierce and terrible cavalry rider of Mosby's Confederacy, well, he gave up the ghost as well. And even no less than Nathan Bedford Forrest, that fierce warrior, that great cavalryman, upon hearing of Lee's and Johnston's actions, well, he would surrender too. Of course, there's one precious little moment that I should tell you about, that Forrest's surrender wasn't evident at first. At one point, Forrest was riding along with an aide, and they came to a fork in the road, and an aide asked, "Which way, General?" And Forrest growled at him, "Either way. If one road led to hell and the other road to Mexico, I wouldn't care which way we went." But in truth, he did care. He wasn't indifferent. He too would surrender, in much the same terms as did Robert E. Lee and Joe Johnston, even saying to his men such things as he knew that war engenders hatred and bitterness, but that the men now had to divest themselves of such feelings. And he furthermore told his men, "Obey the laws, and the government to which you will surrender will treat them magnanimously." And of course, in doing this, he too would be following Robert E. Lee's leads, surrendering in much the same words and terms. All that remained now to complete the reconciliation was two things, two more boils that had to be lanced. Jefferson Davis, the Confederate president, was still on a run, and he showed no signs of turning himself in or surrendering. And for that matter, also on a run was John Wilkes Booth, the assassin of Abraham Lincoln. And we will turn to these two people in our next lecture.
This ends Lecture 12. A House Reunited, Lecture 13. The Final Obstacles to Reconciliation.
As we saw at the end of our last lecture, one by one the remaining Confederate generals in the field surrendered, following the lead of Robert E. Lee and not of Jefferson Davis. Richard Taylor surrendered, Kirby Smith surrendered, John Mosby, the cavalryman, surrendered, even Nathan Bedford Forrest, that dastardly cavalry rider. And one subtle point here that can be made is in how the generals were watching each other carefully and following each other. Yet before true reconciliation could be attained, two obstacles still had to be removed. Jefferson Davis was still on a run, and so was Lincoln's assassin, John Wilkes Booth. And it is to these two men, Jefferson Davis and John Wilkes Booth, that we turn to in this lecture as we look at the ultimate march towards reconciliation at the end of April 1865. But what had happened to Jefferson Davis since the fall of Richmond? We haven't followed him for many lectures. Let's take a look at him now. Well, since the fall of Richmond, as you recall, Jefferson Davis's skeletal government, 12 railroad cars, a government of wheels, had been clanking from one makeshift capital to the next. It clanked from Danville, Virginia, to Charlotte, North Carolina, from Abbeville, South Carolina, and then on to Irwinville, Georgia, and on and on and on. And just as often as not, this government on wheels was met by cheering crowds who came out to see the Confederate president. And at each step along the way, the Confederate president was doing everything he could in his power to ignite the waning Southern heart, even as Jefferson Davis remained the last symbol of a dying Confederacy. It was an odd role for Jefferson Davis, and let's talk about him a bit here. You know, it's very interesting. When the South first seceded, Jefferson Davis didn't even want to be president. He wanted to be the Secretary of War. But who was Davis? Well, Davis was a curious amalgam as well. He was born in a Kentucky log cabin, much like Abraham Lincoln. And Davis had a distinguished career in the United States. He was a graduate of West Point, where surprisingly, he was actually a bit of a hellraiser. He even almost got thrown out of West Point. And then during the Mexican War, he was a hero at the Battle of Buena Vista, which was one of the great battles of the war. And in that battle, he formed his men in a V formation and routed the enemy, the Mexicans, and in doing so, he earned for himself a great national reputation. Jefferson Davis then went on to become a U.S. congressman. And then he went on to become a distinguished Secretary of War under President Franklin Pierce. And here, as Secretary of War, he really did distinguish himself. He was quite innovative in his techniques, and he experimented with a number of things. For example, he actually instituted the Camel Corps, because as it turned out, camels didn't need as much water as horses, and they could actually run twice as fast. And then he became a senator from Mississippi, where Jefferson Davis would earn the sobriquet of the Calhoun of Mississippi. And that, of course, was one of the best things you could say about a Southerner in those days. And after John Calhoun's death, Jefferson Davis would become the leading spokesman for the entire South. Now, to be sure, Jefferson Davis was experienced. He was an erudite legislator, and he could be quite charming if we were to meet him. We would be charmed by his Southern ways. And he was married to the refined Varina Howell of Natchez, Mississippi. And it turns out that Varina's Whig grandfather had been governor of New Jersey. But for all this, Jefferson Davis also had another side to him. He was austere. He was aloof. He could be quite obstinate, and these were all flaws that would mar his presidency of the Confederacy, and in some ways, it would mar them fatally so. There were other things about Jefferson Davis. Throughout his presidency of the Confederacy, he was a sickly man. He was frail, more often than not. He was gaunt. More often than not, he would be agitated, and he suffered from neuralgia that would eventually render him blind in one eye. And as president, his executive management was often poor. He never could really decide whether he wanted to be president or to be Secretary of War, and he would seek to do both of them. But in seeking to do both of them, it could be argued that he really didn't do either well. He vetoed 38 bills, and only one bill was overridden by Congress. By contrast, Abraham Lincoln had to use the veto only 3 times, and it stuck. And then there were other things where Davis made mistakes. He couldn't make up his mind whether the Confederacy should go on the offense or should go into defense. And arguably, by not deciding to do one or the other, he didn't get the best of either worlds. By the same token, Jefferson Davis also took very seriously his pledge to defend every single inch of the Confederacy. But of course, in doing so, he stretched his resources far too thin. And again, throughout the war, Davis was either ill, or he was short-tempered, or he was often autocratic. And he was thin-skinned. And he feuded with governors, he feuded with cabinet members, he feuded with generals, and more often than not, he also was fatally unimaginative. And of course, an example of that, as we had already just discussed, is in how he insisted upon defending every inch of the Confederacy, but in doing so he just stretched the Confederacy way too thin. Yet for all of this, for all of the fact that Davis was always fighting with his cabinet members, fighting with governors, fighting with Confederate senators, for the fact that he didn't know how to delegate well, for the fact that he took too much work upon himself, for the fact that he could be too rigid, in the Confederacy's darkest hours, it is also a fact that Jefferson Davis never gave up, not until the bitter end. When he first learned about Lee's surrender, it was a very kind of powerful moment. In its own way, we could even say it was quite poignant. It struck Jefferson Davis like a fatal blow. The scene was as follows. He was in a cabinet meeting when word of what had happened about Lee's surrender at Appomattox was passed into the room, and as it was passed into the room, it went from cabinet member to cabinet member, and they passed this note around silently until Davis got it. And when Davis got it, he read it, and in front of the cabinet members, he showed no emotion, he showed no sign of concern one way or the other, and what he did was he kept up a brave and stoic front. But we also know this. In private, when he was away from the eyes of everybody else, he wept. By April 15th, Jefferson Davis had covered an astonishing 400 miles in his government on wheels. And yet now he was moving not by train, but was actually being escorted by a small cavalry band. Now, of course, remember, if he's riding on a horse, he's not a young man, and he's going for hundreds of miles. So in that sense, this is really taking a toll on him. And then to Jefferson Davis's horror, later in the month, he would learn about Joe Johnston's insubordination and surrender on April 26th. But even now, when he learned of that, when his two principal generals from the field were removed, when no longer was Robert E. Lee in battle and no longer was Johnston in battle, even then, Jefferson Davis was unwilling to give up the fight. And he continued to move deeper south. And even at that point, he was pledging not to leave Confederate soil as long as there were men willing to fight for the cause. Yet on May 2nd, he would huddle with his military aides in his cabinet once more. And this is another one of those compelling meetings where we can meditate on leadership. Because as we've seen, with some leaders, they find a way to get people to do things they otherwise wouldn't want to do. In Lincoln's case, Lincoln took a country that didn't want to go to war and really never wanted to go to war, and yet he led them through that war. He took generals who really didn't want to fight until he found a general who would fight. And in this case, Jefferson Davis, his task, his goal, was he somehow wanted to rally the South. And he believed that even at this late date, as the month ended, that he could somehow dispel the panic that was gripping the South in the aftermath of Lee's surrender and in the aftermath of Johnston's surrender. And Jefferson Davis believed that once more the people would rally to him. And once more, as he sat down with his military aides in his cabinet, and with a straight face, he gave it everything he had to sort of make the case for continuing the war. And we know that actually in this meeting, considering he was exhausted and tired, and considering they had been on the run now for weeks, Davis actually spoke quite eloquently. But at this stage, the fact of the matter is, he displayed more fervor than judgment. And by now it was too late. As Davis polled his cabinet and looked around, one by one, they made it all clear that they agreed with Robert E. Lee. They felt that at this juncture, with the two major armies out of commission, with the two major generals no longer fighting, that any attempt at this point, they felt, to prolong the conflict would be a cruel injustice. When Jefferson Davis heard this, he was a thoroughly shaken man. He got up, and all of a sudden he seemed unsteady, and he muttered, "All is lost." But even as he stood up and he was shaken, really for the first time, even at this point, Jefferson Davis refused to quit. He was, as we can see, he was a bitter ender. And in his final fight, even as he remained a bitter ender, the fact of the matter is he was also quite dignified. Although we should realize these were quite high-strung moments for him. At one point, he would send a note to his wife, Verena. And remember, Verena came from very good stock. She was the granddaughter of the governor of New Jersey. He said, "Verena, this is not what I had in mind for the two of us." And of course, it also pained him when he sent Verena out of Richmond ahead of him, and he gave her a gun and he gave her instructions as to how to use it if the worst came. So these were high-strung moments for Jefferson Davis and for his wife as they were now moving along. Well, his dwindling procession at this point crossed into Georgia, and now the Union had put a price tag on his head of $100,000, and they accused him, we now know falsely, of complicity in Lincoln's assassination. And at this point, more than ever, the search for Jefferson Davis intensified. Through yet another downpour, he continued to flee. And then on May 10th, it happened. What was it? Well, it was the capture of Jefferson Davis. It happened amid talk of hanging and treason, and Davis was captured by Union cavalry, and when they captured him, they taunted him mercilessly. In fact, when they found him, it was said that he was wearing women's clothing. That's not really true. In fact, what had happened is he tried to put on a woman's shawl to try to escape. But this became yet another thing they could sort of taunt him with. And in the wake of all this taunting, this was one of the things that Abraham Lincoln, as you recall, was one of the things he didn't want to happen, was one of the things he didn't want to pass, that the last thin membrane of civility had seemingly evaporated. And also, as we recall from our previous lectures, Abraham Lincoln was hoping that Jefferson Davis would just somehow vanish. Remember, at that cabinet meeting, Lincoln put up his arms and he said, "Shoo, let them just depart." And that's what he was hoping with Davis. But it hadn't happened. Not only had they now caught him, but Davis was treated like nothing more than a bubbling demagogue. But what was also not in doubt at this point was that with the capture of Jefferson Davis, the last vestige of the Confederate government had now ceased to exist. In fact, on that very same day, the new U.S. President, Andrew Johnson, declared that the armed resistance of the authority to this government may be regarded as virtually at an end. Bear in mind that Johnson said virtually, because one more thing still had to happen. Because for it all to end, there was one more boil that had to be lanced, and that was the capture of the assassin, John Wilkes Booth, to whom we now turn. Well, what had been happening to Booth since the assassination of Abraham Lincoln? As you recall from several lectures earlier, Booth shot Lincoln in Ford's Theater. He made a difficult two-story leap in which he jumped onto the stage, and in the process of jumping onto the stage, he cried out, "Death to tyrants," and he also broke his shin. But then he got on a horse, and he rode off, and that was it for Booth. Well, we now know everything in great detail as to what Booth was doing to escape. Since Easter Sunday, on that April 16th, an unprecedented manhunt had been underway for Booth and his accomplices. Every vessel in the Chesapeake Bay was checked. Every vessel on the Potomac River was checked. Every vessel on the Virginia shores was scoured, and anyone remotely suspicious was picked up. And at this point, an award of $50,000, a lot of money in those days, was put on Booth's head. Lesser amounts of $25,000 and $10,000 was put on the heads of his accomplices. And as one War Department poster declared, it said, "Rest neither night nor day until we accomplish them." Accomplishing at this point meant the capture of Booth, who was the most wanted of all. And soon in the Union, the prisoners were overflowing with hundreds of suspects and potential conspirators. Anyone who had the remotest contact with John Wilkes Booth was thrown in jail, invariably without any charges. Even dozens of poor, hapless souls who only vaguely matched Booth's description were thrown into jail. The belief, which was widely held, was that the South was responsible for the assassination. In fact, Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War, believed it stemmed from a plot in Richmond. This wasn't true, but at this point it didn't matter. It's what they thought was true. And the chase after Booth mounted. By week's end, the extensive search that the Union had underway finally bore results. Some of Booth's accomplices were picked up. For example, Lewis Powell, a.k.a. Lewis Payne, he was caught. And just to remind you who Lewis Powell was, he was this hulking man who knocked on Seward's door, Seward, the Secretary of State, stabbed 4 people, and then stabbed Seward 5 times. And so is George Atzerodt. He was picked up. Atzerodt was the assassin whose role was to knock on Andrew Johnson's door at 10:15 and plunge a Bowie knife in his heart. But only at the last second did Atzerodt get cold feet. And a host of other tangential accomplices, they were also picked up. But for all the manpower being applied, the fact of the matter is the Union dart, had not quite yet hit its target. Booth and his erstwhile accomplice, Davy Herold, were still at large. And what had been happening with Booth? How had he gotten away? Well, for days now, Booth had been on the run, and he had been in hiding. The night of the assassination, he had escaped across the Potomac. In fact, how did he escape across the Potomac? Well, as it turns out, that he was moving faster than news of Lincoln's assassin. And when he got to the bridge, he did something quite clever. He said, "I'm John Wilkes Booth." And of course, John Wilkes Booth was one of the most famous people in America at the time. And so they just let him cross the Potomac. And then for a time, Booth stayed at Mary Surratt's Tavern. And an interesting little side note is Mary Surratt was later hung as a result. The only woman who was hung at the end of the war, and it created quite a furor. And then Booth made his way to Dr. Samuel Mudd's house in Maryland, where once he was there, a leg splint and a set of crude crutches was fashioned for him. It is believed that Mudd was totally in the dark about the assassination, and certainly Booth said nothing about it. But as Booth slept that night in Mudd's house, as he kind of wrapped himself up and he was in pain from his broken leg, he could hear outside thousands of Union troops were now crawling over the countryside. Within 6 days, as it turned out, Mudd would be arrested. And in fact, more than Mudd being arrested, they would find Booth's slit riding boot. And this was a key piece of information that would become a godsend for the Union pursuers. And by slit riding boot, I should say, I mean a riding boot that was slit because of the swelling from Booth's broken leg. And at this point, with this boot, this key piece of information, the Union now concentrated on what they called lame man sightings in their search. And now, with an ever-growing number of Union troops combing the countryside and manhandling local residents wherever they went, Booth was having trouble, it turns out, hiding even in the midst of a notoriously pro-Southern population. But at one point, they finally got a break. They did hook up with a Confederate agent, and this Confederate agent wanted to help them in any way he could, and one of the things he did for them was he fed them. He fed them ham and bread and butter. And the agent later would say that when he had Booth in his care, that Booth looked exceedingly pale, and that his face bore what he thought were evident traces of genuine suffering. Some days later, on April 21st, Booth and Harold then got a second break. They wanted to cross the Potomac into Virginia. The first night when they did that, they tried and they failed. The current took them upstream, and then it actually sent them back onto the D.C. side. That night, Booth wrote a little note. He said in his diary, "I try to escape these bloodhounds once more." And then finally, on that second night, he did get a break, and he was able to cross over into the Virginia side. Of course, once in Virginia, he thought, and he hoped, and he believed, that he would have a much better time of hiding out, because he would be within a population that would be far more receptive and friendly to the Confederates and to the Confederacy. But even in Virginia, as it turns out, help was scarce. Why? Because otherwise loyal Confederates were worried about the consequences of housing such a prominent figure as John Wilkes Booth. Because at this point, Union soldiers and Union law enforcement agents, they were now everywhere. So at this point, Booth sought refuge at the Richard Garrett tobacco farm, a tobacco farm owned by this man named Richard Garrett. And this tobacco farm was so isolated, if you can believe it, that news of the assassination had not yet even reached them. At this point, Booth now began to plot his final escape to Mexico. He thought he finally would be able to do what he needed to do and escape from the clutches, finally, of the Union. But even as he thought that, his luck would soon run out, because as it turns out, and his luck would run out on April 25 to be precise, a Union cavalry would pass right by the Garrett farm. Now at this point, Booth was still able to elude the Unionists, but nonetheless he would make a fatal mistake, because his anxious reaction would deeply rattle their hosts. At this point, Richard Garrett became a little suspicious, and he looked over to his son, and he said, "Make sure to watch that man." And he also told Booth and Harold they were no longer welcome to sleep in his house. And what would take place there would be this arguing back and forth, where Booth would say, "Please let us stay for just one more night." And Garrett shook his head no. And then Booth said, "Well, at least sell me your horse." And Garrett shook his head no. But eventually, Booth was able to persuade Garrett to allow them at least to sleep there for one final night. But Garrett wasn't taking any chances. He refused to allow them to enter into his house. He said, "If you're going to sleep here, you have to sleep in a tobacco barn." And that's what happened. Yet around midnight, Union troops would get another tip, and the dragnet would quickly close in around Booth while he was sleeping in that tobacco barn. Soon they were surrounded. And at this point, Harold would surrender. Davy Harold wasn't going to do anything. He just surrendered to the Union cavalry outside. But John Wilkes Booth, he refused. Now he was inside this barn, and he was cradling 3 pistols, and he also had a rifle as well. Booth called out in a loud voice, and he asked for a sporting chance to shoot it out. But the Union officers denied his request. "Well, my brave boys," Booth then said, "you can prepare a stretcher for me." And it was at this point that a Union officer twisted some hay into rope, lit it, and threw it into the back of the barn, which soon began to burn, exploding into flames. Now this, of course, would become the oddest of ends for John Wilkes Booth in his last great play. But who was John Wilkes Booth really? Let's get to know him a little bit more. Let's talk about him a bit for the remaining part of this lecture. It's quite a story about who John Wilkes Booth was. Booth himself was from one of the most famous acting families in all of America. His father was considered the greatest Shakespearean actor of his generation. Booth's brother, Edwin, was an even better actor, and he is considered perhaps one of the greatest actors of all time in America, then or now. Booth's brother Junius was a successful producer, and Booth himself was a rising Shakespearean star in America. He was handsome. I mean, to look at him, you would see he was handsome. He had this dark, wavy hair. He had these alluring hazel eyes, and he had a neatly cropped mustache. And he really had an unmistakable allure about him wherever he went. And women, of course, were drawn to him. It seemed wherever he went, and he was able to travel freely throughout the war in North as well as South, which is quite unique. It seemed he had girlfriends in every town where he performed and where his plays played. And audiences also were drawn to him all across America. They were drawn to his exotic demeanor, they were drawn to his flamboyant gestures, and they were drawn to his eloquence. And they were drawn as well to his impassioned, his athletic style of acting. By 1864, Booth, who was so swashbuckling, who was doing so well, he was earning $20,000 a year, which was a lot of money in those days, of course. And in fact, just to give you a sense of it, $20,000 a year was double what Robert E. Lee made as General-in-Chief of all the Confederacy's armies, and it was 4 times what Lincoln had made as a lawyer in Illinois. And Booth's fame was so great that one of his most ardent admirers was, of course, the President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln had seen him in a number of plays. Yet Booth was an equally ardent supporter of the Confederacy, and he despised Abraham Lincoln. He despised him with every bone in his body. He regarded Lincoln as a tyrant who he believed was going to overthrow the Constitution, and he became so obsessed with his hatred for Lincoln that it would literally drive Booth to a breaking point. Eventually, Booth would retire from the stage because he was so driven by hatred for Lincoln and so wanted to help the Southern cause that he began to focus on a plan to kidnap the United States president and hold him for ransom for rebel prisoners now withering away in Union jails. Yet for all his planning, soon this plan collapsed of its own weight because it was so impractical. But even as this plan collapsed of its weight, it would metastasize soon into another plan, into a plan to kill Abraham Lincoln himself, in which he would be aided by a band of conspirators that he had now recruited. What is so remarkable in hindsight is not that Booth would seek to assassinate Lincoln and decapitate the government with a motley band of misfits, but how close he came to decapitating the entire head of the Union government. You know, many historians sort of make fun of Booth and his little motley crew, but my feeling is quite the opposite. I feel like they came pretty darn close, in spite of what he had. In the final days, we see something different with Booth, though. He wasn't just driven by rage, but at this point he was depressed, and he was drinking heavily. And it was at this point, as he was depressed and drinking heavily, that Booth would concoct for himself the greatest role that he could play. He saw himself as a second William Tell, and instead of bringing down the tyrannical Caesar, Booth thought he would bring down the tyrannical Abraham Lincoln. And ironically, with his murder of Abraham Lincoln, Booth would actually now jeopardize what he had hoped to save, placing the enormous stock of the Union government's goodwill engendered at Appomattox totally at risk. And now, as John Wilkes Booth's barn went up in flames on April 26, Booth made a move towards the barn door. Just imagine if you were there. Imagine this night. It was a night that began with Booth having dinner at the Richard Garrett farm. It was a night where all of a sudden they could hear Union cavalry outside. And even though the Union cavalry didn't capture them or even see them, it would so rattle Booth that his anxious behavior would give him away to his host. And that was when his host said, "You can't sleep in the house, you can only sleep in the barn." And this was the barn he was in. And now this barn was up in flames. And, of course, Booth would not come out and surrender. He said, "My boys, prepare a stretcher for me." And it was then that a shot rang out. All of a sudden, Booth, with his 3 guns and his rifle, pitched over face first. He was still breathing, but barely. In the half-light that precedes dawn, Union soldiers took this ailing Booth, who was now shot, and they dragged him away, and they placed him on the porch of the Garrett farmhouse. This whole scene, the only way to describe it, I guess, is I can say it was morbid, it was melodramatic, yet it was all quite real. As the sun began to climb, Booth all of a sudden asked to see his hands. And he held them up and he looked at them, and he said, "Useless, useless." He said this through his kind of lips turned purple. What did he mean by this? We'll never know. At another point, after rambling some more, all of a sudden he told the men around him, and this was one moment where he was coherent. He said, "Tell my mother that I died for my country." Ironically, Booth had always clamored for great fame, and in his own day, let's not forget, he was as famous, say, as a Barbra Streisand today or a Robert Redford. Just imagine them killing the president. But now, in all his infamy, he would be remembered even more. Now, one more final thing we want to look at with John Wilkes Booth, the final days of his life. And in these final days of his life, in his growing rage and in his growing madness, Booth had increasingly been rambling in what he talked about at the end of the war. He had increasingly been inflated in what he talked about at the end of the war. And he had increasingly been contrived in his explanations and thoughts about America, the Union, and the Confederacy at the end of the war. But on one thing, he wasn't rambling, he wasn't inflated, and he wasn't contrived in his explanations. When Booth died, they would find a little red pocket diary, and as they flipped through the pocket pages, they would find one particularly pungent observation. And that observation was this: John Wilkes Booth wrote in his diary, "The country is not, April 1865, what it was." No, indeed it wasn't. But with Booth and Davis now removed from the picture, the country could finally move forward. As long lines of refugees crept home, news of the war's end now spread rapidly across the Union. In the South, it moved slowly, but move it did. And what now, we ask? How would the country finally put itself back together again? Well, these final days would turn not on issues of battle or war, but on politics and on justice. But foremost of all was the question of healing. We've seen this, we've been talking about this for many lectures now. We know that the North had gambled with total war and won. We know that the South had wagered all and lost. And we know the Confederacy now is no more. But one more question loomed. Could these two distant sides reconcile themselves to each other? I want to discuss one other thing with you for the remaining bit of this lecture. It's so terribly important, and it's too often clouded by time and myth. Because too often time and myth have clouded the fact that as the guns of the war went on, at the end of the war, emotions still seethed greatly. We have this wonderful idea that it was brothers sort of embracing with brother, but the fact of the matter is at the end of the war, the hate was as perilous as ever, and it did not augur well for the future. Remember, the South was willing actually to scrap slavery. They so hated the Union if they could somehow keep their independence. And as one Southerner put it at the end of the war, he said that he woke up every day at 4:30 in the morning, and he would sit up till midnight just hating the Yankees. And one woman put it another way. She said, "Oh, how I hate these Yankees. I could just trample on their dead bodies and spit on them." Well, we do know this. The hatred would not vanish overnight. Lincoln always knew that his challenge was how to overcome this hatred. He always knew that his challenge was how to incorporate an entity that had been laid waste to, an entity that had in effect become a separate nation, and somehow to make two nations into one. And if the hatred wasn't bad enough, there was also the despondency that had to be dealt with as well. For all its grievous sins, and finally slavery was dead for all time, the economic damage and destruction to Southern property, which was now, I remind you, U.S. territory once more, was almost unparalleled throughout history. The South had lost a full 2/3 of its assessed wealth in the war, a staggering statistic. And also daunting and staggering was the emotional wreckage. Mary Chestnut, the astute socialite and diarist, put it this way. She said in a kind of quiet voice, "We are scattered, we're stunned. The deep waters are crossing over us. I thought I was dying. I thought I was dead." By late April 1865, there were only faint echoes of the once lively, hot-blooded antebellum era. Hungry young children now roamed alleyways shoeless. Dirt-smudged orphans cried for fathers that would never come back. Once robust generals were now cripples. Commerce was largely non-existent. A generation of women would go unwed because so many men had died in the South, and civil authority was scant. In every direction, there was a broad social numbing that would affect generations in the war's aftermath. In so much of the South, their people were incoherent with grief. By contrast, the picture in the North was more mixed. They had fought a great victory and won, and while the Union was riding high in a cloud of euphoria, which was understandable, the fact was their euphoria was largely irreconcilable with the South's heartbreak. It was one thing for the country to be kept together by force of arms, quite another, as Lincoln had so fervently recognized when he was alive, to bind up its wounds. Well, could it be done? Or would the country descend into hate or despondency or vengeance that could have steeped this country in rancor and chaos and destroyed any real possibility of true union? But it did not. True, over 620,000 lay dead, 1/12 of the North's population and a staggering 1/5 of the South's. Yet somehow, in the midst of the hatred and the heartbreak, in the midst of the chaos and despondency, America would not succumb to the temptation of vengeance or guerrilla war, or continuing bloodshed and turmoil that had afflicted so many other nations throughout history in the aftermath of civil war, the Bosnias, the Northern Irelands, the Balkans, or the Middle East today. Yet how did we escape this cruel chain of history, as it afflicted so many other countries? In fact, everywhere across America at the end of April 1865, there was an awareness now of endings and beginnings. This would be the story of how the nation ultimately reconciled. We will turn to this in our next and last lecture.
After listening to Lecture 13, a student posed this question to Professor Winik. Is it possible that the government of the Confederacy was behind Lincoln's assassination? Let's listen to the professor's response.
This is one of those questions that one can really debate endlessly. And let me make a little confession here. When I first set about writing my book, April 1865, one of the things that struck me as I was doing my research on how, even though on one hand there was a consensus about the sway of events and what happened, and I'll get to that in 1 second, the fact of the matter is this seemed to be one of those imponderables in history that you can never fully resolve. And I decided I didn't want to sort of fall into that pit of resolving something that historians who do nothing but look at that one small, minute issue will debate decade after decade after decade. The consensus is that Jefferson Davis and the Confederacy had nothing to do with the plot to assassinate Lincoln and to decapitate the head of the Union government. When I say the head, I mean not just Lincoln, but the Vice President and the Secretary of State as well. It is widely acknowledged among the mainstream consensus of academics and historians of the Civil War that it was really John Wilkes Booth who hatched the idea. It was John Wilkes Booth who put together the sort of band of conspirators. It was John Wilkes Booth who saw to the conclusions. Having said all this, there has been some newer and more recent scholarship in which several Civil War historians have suggested that perhaps there might have been a link between the Secret Service of the South, the Confederate Secret Service, and John Wilkes Booth, perhaps in terms of them funneling him gold or money or some such thing. Now, even if that were the case, it doesn't mean that Jefferson Davis knew about it or had anything to do with it. You know, in our own day and age, the fact remains that there have been times where, for example, the CIA has done things that nobody else has known about. So perhaps the Confederate Secret Service might have been involved in some way, shape, and form. But on the whole, I think my answer would be Jefferson Davis and the Confederate leadership didn't know about it and had nothing to do with it. And one other thing that I think would back this up is it's clear that in the war, it wasn't obvious that Davis would do anything to win the war. You know, in Abraham Lincoln's case, he was willing to wage total war, even to wage war against the cities and innocent civilians if it meant restoring the Union. But the South refused to wage total war in their case. They wouldn't do it. And, you know, and at one point, and this is fascinating, and one of the aides to Jefferson Davis, the Confederate president, came to him and proposed a plan in which they would send smallpox-infected blankets into the Union. Of course, had they done that, they might have devastated the Union. It might have led to tens of thousands of deaths, and it could have changed the whole nature of the war, but it would have been a terrible thing to have done. And as it turns out, Davis didn't even consider it. He vetoed it from the start. So that suggests that Davis was not willing to do anything to win the war, but he was operating within the sort of accepted framework and rules of warfare as they knew it in that day and age.
This ends Lecture 13. A House Reunited, Lecture 14. What happened to make a nation?
As we saw in our last lecture, slowly the healing was ready to begin. Finally, at long last, John Wilkes Booth had been captured and killed. Jefferson Davis had been caught and would be put into jail in Fort Monroe. And at this point, finally, the healing could start at long last. So for our 14th and last lecture of this course, we're going to ask the question, what happened? How did we come together? How did we reconcile? How did we go from being two nations and finally make one nation? The healing would begin in many ways with mourning. Sometime after the middle of the month, on April 19th, Abraham Lincoln, his casket would be put in state. It would lie in the East Room of the White House. And on that day, it was a gorgeous day. The sun was shining and beams of sun were coming in. But not inside, because in the White House, everywhere, it was covered in black with a sign of mourning. Black was on the stairs, black was on the doors, black was on the tables, black was even on the paintings. And then there amidst all this black lay Abraham Lincoln in his coffin, resting amid a bed of flowers. And at his feet was a sprig of roses that was there as well. And when the services began, this would be the final goodbye to Abraham Lincoln. The services began, and 600 people would crowd into this room, this East Room of the White House, and all of official Washington would be there. President Johnson was there. The cabinet was there. The Supreme Court was there. Leading senators, of course, were there. And so were top generals as well as the diplomatic corps. And in one end sat a very lonely man for whom it was the worst day of his life. That was General Grant. Grant sat there and he was wearing a little black mourning crepe wound around his arm. And in full view of everyone, this man who had led the Union to this sort of mighty heroic victory, this man who was able to send men off to their death and sent them out into battle like slabs of meat, this man who never was done in by emotion, yet in front of everyone else there he would weep. And U.S. Grant would later say that this was the saddest day of his life. This sort of goodbye to Lincoln continued. The coffin would be taken from the East Room of the White House, and it would be taken in a funeral procession that would wind its way all up Pennsylvania Avenue. This would be a goodbye with almost machine-like efficiency. In one part of this procession would be a riderless horse, and in this riderless horse were Lincoln's boots, and this horse would lead the way. Along with this procession would be a detachment of black troops, and these mourners on this day, they were trudging along to the steady, muffled roll of drums. And as they marched along, there were battalions behind them, and then there were regiments behind them, and then there were wounded soldiers behind them. And under a great blue sky, and the sky seemed to sort of swell and curve on this sort of lovely, beautiful day, there would be a group of some 4,000 more black citizens who would be marching quietly along. And as this whole procession was moving along, as this final goodbye to Abraham Lincoln in Washington, D.C., heavy artillery rumbled in the background. And then eventually this procession, this goodbye to Abraham Lincoln, would reach the Capitol. And there Lincoln would lay in the rotunda of the Capitol beneath a portrait of George Washington. The only thing that was not covered in black was that portrait of George Washington. Just imagine if you were there on that day. Just imagine the sense of sorrow, the sense of just really despair over losing the president who had led the Union for 4 long years. Well, for 2 days, as it turns out, some thousands and thousands of people would file through this Capitol to pay their last respects to Abraham Lincoln. Noah Brooks, one of Lincoln's aides, recorded it in his diary. He put it this way. He said that the people moving through were like black atoms moving over a sheet of gray. And he said they just crept silently in 2 long dark lines across the pavement rotunda, and they did it for 2 days. And then the next day, that day of course would be April 21st, Lincoln was ready to take his final trip home. He would be put on a funeral train. It would have 9 cars, and this funeral train would make a 14-day journey back to Illinois. And it would retrace the exact route that then newly elected President Abraham Lincoln had taken to Washington 4 years earlier. For these 14 days, the train would creep forward, and as it would creep forward from city to city, from area to area, to region, there would be ringing bells in a soft spring landscape. And all along the route, wherever this train went, the people would gather to watch in silence as this train rolled by. In Philadelphia, that was one prominent city where they watched, and there the mourners would actually stretch for a line that went 3 miles deep. In New York City, the procession would continue for 4 long hours, and on one building there would be a sign that was very poignant and very powerful, and it would say something to the effect of, "Mankind has lost a friend, and we have lost a president." And in New York on that day was Walt Whitman, of course the marvelous poet. And Walt Whitman would also say that this was one of the saddest days of his life. And he would compose a famous poem about lilacs and spring blossoms on that day. And every day for the rest of his life, he would say this would remind him of Abraham Lincoln going back home to where he would lie at rest. And also on that day was another prominent person watching. It was a 6-year-old. It was Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt would be leaning out of the second-floor window of his grandfather's townhouse on Broadway. But the procession continued beyond New York City. It would go to Buffalo, and then it would go to Cleveland. And of course in Cleveland, there would be some 10,000 mourners who would actually go despite a cold, steady rain that was falling. Then in Indianapolis, as the train was going by to take Lincoln home, the train would almost be gliding by as bonfires were lit on the side of the railroad tracks. Imagine how powerful and how tender and how touching that must have been. And then in Chicago, Lincoln would go through. And then finally Lincoln would make his way in his train to Springfield, Illinois. This was Lincoln's home. It was where the great Union president began, and it was where the great Union president would finally be laid to rest. You know, it's interesting. During this whole procession, thousands and thousands and thousands of mourners would bring flowers to wherever Lincoln's train was. They brought lilacs. They brought roses. They brought lilies. They brought blossoms. They brought anything in bloom. And actually, this was the first time that really had happened. Thus was born a new American tradition as well, as a result of Abraham Lincoln's procession home, laying flowers at a funeral. And then, after Abraham Lincoln was laid to rest, then the Union at that point, the country at that point, was ready to move to a next step. After the mourning would come the pageantry. After the mourning would come what would really be 2 days of national catharsis and a mighty sign and symbol of unity. On May 22nd, all the emblems of mourning were taken down. And now what Washington would do in Washington, D.C., is they would have 2 days of a grand review of the armies of the Republic. Miles upon miles of stars and stripes would be everywhere, as these triumphant armies, these triumphant Union armies, would march down Pennsylvania Avenue from the Capitol. Some 150,000 men of these Union armies would march all told. On the first day, the mighty army that would be marching down Pennsylvania Avenue would be the Army of the Potomac, Grant's mighty army. Let's not forget who this army was. This was the army, this was the machine that halted Lee at Antietam. This was the army that stymied Lee on day 3 at Gettysburg. This was the army that chased him week after week, as we saw several times throughout this course, in the bloody wilderness. And this was the army, as we saw in great depth, the army that finally subdued Robert E. Lee at Appomattox. And then on the next day, on day 2 of this great pageantry, these 2 days of national catharsis, it became the turn for Sherman's army, the men of the West, to walk down Pennsylvania Avenue. Now, they looked very different from Grant's army. Grant's army had a look of the Easterners, but these men of the West, they were lean, they were tall, they were bony, and they had a kind of rough frontier look as well. And now, who were these men? Well, let's remember who these men were, and we saw them in the course of our course. These were the men who took Atlanta. These were the men who marched to the sea and burned Columbia. These were the men who made the South tremble. And the crowd loved them. Now remember, Bill Sherman had been in a lot of trouble as a result of his negotiations with Joe Johnston, and Andrew Johnson and the Union cabinet were furious at him. That didn't matter, because on this day, the crowd loved Bill Sherman more than ever. When they saw him, they shouted, "Hurrah, hurrah!" And by day's end, they were shouting even hurrah even more. And at one point, and this is a curious little afternote, Sherman would actually be by Johnston and Stanton, and he would actually refuse to shake their hands. But by day's end, after this 2-day procession, this 2-day review of these armies, this pageantry, it became clear that this was time for closure, and it was time for moving on, at least in the Union. But in the South, what now? How were they to move on? Well, once proud Confederates would now have to reintegrate themselves into the United States, and they would have to become, once again, good citizens, as Robert E. Lee had so often urged them. This is something that happened and is too often uncelebrated throughout history. And history books, I want to stress, really don't make enough of this. And it's too often little noticed. But in fits and starts and in 1,000 little ways, the fact of the matter is this process of reintegration, of Southerners becoming, as Lee had urged, good citizens, as Southerners becoming Americans, once again, would begin. Sam Watkins, one Confederate private, would sort of say something very nice about this whole process. He said something to the effect of how the sun rises over the hills and it sets over the mountains. And then he also pointed out how the compass would point up and down, but we can laugh now at the notion of there being a north and a south. Because as Watkins put it, he said, we are now one and undivided. To be sure, though, the process would proceed awkwardly, in fits and starts, but it did proceed. And indeed, there's one memorable day that I want to talk about especially for this final lecture of our course that would take place at St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Richmond in that late spring. Now remember St. Paul's Episcopal Church. That was the church where Jefferson Davis was when he received the fateful news that Richmond was about to fall. This was the church for all the elite, all the establishment, all the great officials of the Confederacy. Once more, they were here praying and worshiping. And on this day, as communion was about to be administered, as communion was about to begin, a well-dressed black man would unexpectedly advance to the communion table. And I say unexpectedly because nothing like this had ever happened before in Richmond, or at this church where the elites of Richmond worshipped. Typically what had happened was that in the churches of the South and in Richmond, the whites would receive communion first, and then the blacks would receive communion. This was a small but strictly adhered to ritual that was repeated so often for so many years that to alter it would literally seem unthinkable. Yet as this black man walked up to the chancellery rail to take communion, all of a sudden the whole congregation froze. And also who would freeze would be Charles Minigrode, the minister. As this black man walked up, everybody stopped, everybody tensed, and everybody wondered what would happen next. It was one thing they felt for the South to have lost the war. It was one thing for them to have had their land laid waste to. It was one thing for them to have suffered the humiliation and desolation of losing a war and of losing their economy, 2/3 of their wealth. But now it was quite another thing to have the heavens turned upside down, they felt, in their own churches. For them, this seemed to be way too much. At this point, the congregation tensed, as did Minnegard, but then suddenly, a man would sort of get up, and as he got up, his gait was erect, and he would walk quietly to the side of that black man. Now, this man looked older, he looked a little grayer, and his face really looked like it was the very picture of exhaustion. And this was a man who did not look well. He just did not look like he was in the best of health, and it was clear that the recent days had been hard on him. This was also a man who had only recently said, "I am homeless, I am penniless, I have nothing left to live for." But more than that, this was also a man to whom Southerners looked to for guidance and a sense of purpose. This man now knelt down to take communion alongside the same rail with a black man. And as the other communicants watched Robert E. Lee do this, with great reluctance and expectation, they would now follow him into the future. Because the fact of the matter is, and I want to stress this as much as anything for this part of the lecture, things were now changing in America. Walt Whitman would explain it this way. He said something to the effect of, "Strange, is it not, that battles and martyrs and blood and even assassination would be so necessary to finally make us a nation, to finally condense us into a nationality?" And even T. Morris Chester, remember him? He was the black correspondent, the one former slave in the North, who was filing dispatches from the Confederate capital in Richmond. He wrote at the time, "Strange as it may seem, all classes of persons in Richmond are heartily rejoiced to be in the old Union, and many of them were rebels from the beginning." In truth, this is a very subtle but important point for us to grasp as we seek to understand what happened in April 1865. In a very profound but very real sense, a link of history had been destroyed. Regionalism, which would always be a factor in American life, true enough, but destroyed in April 1865 was any serious thought of future secession, by any side, any state, any section. It used to be said before the war that the United States are. In other words, it would be said the United States are growing, or they are vivid, or they are dynamic. But somehow in the final weeks and final days after April 1865, it became the United States is. In other words, we went from a plural to a singular, from a loose confederation of states to finally becoming one nation. True, much hard work would remain, but much had already been accomplished in this pregnant little precious period. By war's end, it was clear that the states alone were no longer America, and America was no longer states, because in April 1865, what was gone forever would be that talk in the United States of replicating other civilizations. We would no longer try to be like a new Rome, or we would no longer try to be like a new Athens, or even a new London. We would be one nation. We would be the United States of America. Now, to be sure, and I know this is perhaps something that you're thinking about, there would be one area that would challenge this new nation, the question of emancipation. The treatment of the new black citizens in America would be a problem that would remain with this country for a good 100 more years, if not longer, some would say. But there were important changes. Houston Holloway, a slave who had been sold 3 times before the age of 20, he would have these very kind of powerful words to say. In 1865, when he was emancipated, when he was freed, he said he felt like a bird out of the cage, amen, amen, amen. And also as a result of emancipation. No longer, as we had already discussed in our course, would blacks be sold like animals, or mothers ripped from children, or husbands ripped from wives, or sisters ripped from brothers. Now, at long last, blacks would be able to choose where they lived and what they did. They would be able to choose how to educate their children and themselves. They would be able to choose, finally, where and to whom they would be married, and when. And instead of being property, they would now be able to own property. This is really a great moment, just fervent with hope and possibilities. Of course, I know what you're thinking. In time, the path of freedom would be littered over the years that would follow, and it would be a difficult road for many black Americans. But of course, it would be a difficult road for many Americans of other stripes as well. To be sure, post-war America would be marred by the Ku Klux Klan. It would be marred by episodic, if not horrific, violence, and it would be marred in the South by black codes that would be nearly as restrictive as the antebellum laws governing free blacks before the war. But don't forget this either. In the North, it wasn't always much better. In the northern states, they would have poll taxes, they would have literacy requirements, and they would have property qualifications that would restrict black freedoms almost every bit as much as would happen in the South. But the fact of the matter is, for all the unspeakable repression, the brutality, and the violence, we must not forget what else has happened and accomplished on the road to April 1865. And this is why it would be one of the most, if not the most important months in our nation's history, and arguably for what it would mean for the nation in world history. In this regard, I've often been asked the question, aren't we still fighting the Civil War? You know, with the debates over the Confederate flags and states' rights and reenactors and all the rest. Well, let me tell you this. Once upon a time, I would have been tempted to say yes, but not now. Here's my thinking. Today, when there are differences over issues, no matter how hard they're fought, no matter how divergent we are, they are invariably resolved peacefully through the political process. And this is unlike in so many other countries throughout the world that have suffered civil wars. In our country, there is no discussion of secession or breakup of the country. And even if this is true, that if one looks at the aftermath of our Civil War, at the years of repression and horrific violence that was often waged against blacks and perhaps others, the fact of the matter is we didn't become like so many of these other terrible countries hit by civil wars. It is noteworthy that this violence was, in the aftermath and in the final analysis that would follow the war, and no matter how regrettable, it was episodic. And it was not done with a goal in mind of liberating the South or creating a new country. So the difference is all the difference in the world between our country, which we see today, in which we try to resolve things peacefully through politics, even if at times heated, and those countries where they do things on the battlefield, where they seek to reverse the conclusions of the wars, in places like Northern Ireland or in Basque Spain or the Balkans or Afghanistan or even the Middle East, where year after year, with melancholy regularity, the violence and the bloodshed continues, seemingly without end. In effect, what we see, and this is why April 1865 was such a crucial month in the life of this nation, if not the most crucial moment in the life of this nation, April 1865 was that magical moment when somehow America escaped the cruel fate afflicting so many other nations in history, where it avoided becoming like a Northern Ireland. It avoided becoming like a Balkans. It avoided becoming like an Afghanistan, or it avoided becoming like the Middle East. Somehow, that cruel chain of history that had ruled so much of history, it was broken in April 1865, and somehow these two nations would become one. In the end, for all the changes and the turmoil that we would face, the idea of America as a nation would somehow, for the first time, become the most powerful, compelling idea for our country. It would become the arena for peaceful resolution of political differences. It would almost be, in a sense, the kind of stitch in the fabric that even the founders missed. To be sure, we can say this. We know that political tastes come and go. We know that political fashions change. And we know that over the years, heated arguments are waged in this country. They're waged about political candidates. They're waged about political parties. They're waged about specific public policies. And they're waged about the very idea of the nature of the state and size of government itself. But in one idea, almost one idea only, would there be total unity after April 1865. And that would be the idea of the nation. This is perhaps the most subtle, most important point of this entire course for us to grasp. And in the late spring days after the war, we could glimpse it even then how America at long last would become one nation. And let me get almost poetical here a little bit. Across the Potomac, we knew that the guns had fallen silent. We knew that the sounds of bugles that were blaring in the air, that shrill yip-yip of the rebel yell that one would see in the Civil War, they would never again be heard. Instead, what was heard was this. A bittersweet process of rebuilding would begin. T.S. Eliot, that wonderful poet, he would one day write, "April is the cruelest month." And he also wrote, "I had not thought death had undone so many." But that would be the terrible grandeur of the war. At the end of the war, there would be flag-draped coffins that would be slowly lowered in the ground. As tearful widows would comb the remains of battlefields, lamps held in one hand, and they would be turning over corpses to search for their husbands with their other hand. As bareheaded Americans everywhere would tremble in the evening's cold, and as maimed ex-soldiers would limp their way home, finally, at long last, the nation, this nation, would collectively stride into a new era. And it would continue still. So what happened? How, when all is said and done, how did America escape the cruel edicts of history? How did we not become like the Balkans, or Northern Ireland, or Cambodia, or Rwanda, or the Middle East today? How did we escape the ongoing bloodshed and violence that wrecks so much of the world in the horrific wake of civil war? And here I can give you an aside. Poor violence-torn Afghanistan suffered its first bout of civil war in 1863. It has never been the same since. How did this become, arguably, the most important, and certainly one of the most important months in our nation's, if not in world history. Well, in the end, there are a number of explanations, but more than anything else, it comes down to a handful of men. There would be a handful of men who would rise in April 1865, and on the road to April 1865, above and beyond the passions and the hatreds of the day. They would rise above and beyond the calls for revenge on one hand, and the calls for vengeance on one hand, and the calls for guerrilla war and continuing secession on the other. These men, these were men who would literally rise above and beyond themselves in search for a long-term vision for the nation. First and foremost, it begins with Abraham Lincoln. It was Lincoln who sketched the vision at City Point of a tender peace, which we saw at the month's beginning, when he talked about a tender peace, a magnanimous peace. It was Lincoln who stressed that we must become brothers and countrymen again. And it was Lincoln who stressed there must be no hangings, there must be no bloody work, there must be none of that. And it was Lincoln who, as we saw, gave his magnificent second inaugural, in which he called for malice for none. It was Lincoln who we saw went on to Richmond, and when asked how the defeated rebels should be treated, it was Lincoln who said, I would let them up easy, I would let them up easy. So it was Lincoln, more than anyone else, who would really pave the way. But after Lincoln, there were also his two generals, U.S. Grant and Bill Sherman. Both of these generals were advocates of total war to savage the South, advocates of doing whatever it took to bring the South to its knees. Yet they would also act brilliantly in following Lincoln's wishes and Lincoln's spirit. It was Grant at Appomattox who so brilliantly and so generously handled Robert E. Lee. And later in the month, I can also add, a court threatened to indict Robert E. Lee for treason, and Grant stepped in and said, no, this must not happen. So Grant, too, would play a great part. Grant, that terrible total warrior, would also play a role in the peace and the healing. And then there was also Bill Sherman. Bill Sherman, who said, war is hell and you cannot refine it. Bill Sherman, who burned Atlanta and burned Columbia, and who cut a path of some 600 miles of death and destruction. We too often forget, though, but we did see a bit of this in our lectures, but it was also Sherman who said, when this war is over, I will share with you my last cracker. And he did indeed, with his generosity, as we saw at Bennett House with Joe Johnston and the negotiations there. So Bill Sherman also played a great role in April 1865 as well. But as we look around the world at all these civil wars, where the violence never ends, where it never seems to flame out, where year after year and decade after decade, it sometimes takes two sides to create a lasting peace, a true healing. And fortunately, this is the case of what would happen in the United States. Ironically, almost paradoxically, the man who had so bedeviled Abraham Lincoln for so long, the man who was so responsible for why the bloodshed went on for 4 long years, the man who had brought the war to a point where it seemed that the South might win, or that the North might not win, which would be the same thing. This man, Robert E. Lee, would turn out to be the most important partner in peace to Abraham Lincoln, even after Lincoln's death. The personal sacrifices of these men, of this handful of individuals, was often quite great. In the end, we see that Abraham Lincoln would give his life for this vision. And we also see that Robert E. Lee would live only 5 short-lived years of his life, broken-hearted, and he would not become a citizen for the rest of his life, nor for another 100 years thereafter. Let's go over some of the things for a second that we have done in our course, that we've seen in the course of our lectures. We've learned about many things. We've learned about how this nation, when it started out, it was so fragile and fragmented, and its early history just repeated and underscored just how precarious it was. We saw the repeated bouts of secession that began in this country, where there was almost secession east-west with the Whiskey Rebels and the Whiskey Rebellion. We saw the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions that asserted the rights of individual states to not nullify the act of the federal government. We saw the War of 1812, in which it wasn't east-west or north-south, but it was New England that was discussing secession. We saw later how New Jersey discussed secession, and California did, and Oregon, and literally in the weeks up to the Civil War, so did New York. Now we also saw how there were a number of turning points in the war. We learned about how, later in the course of April 1865, guerrilla war would become a very real and a very profound threat, and we saw how it would somehow be averted. We learned about the ambiguities of the Constitution concerning who becomes president in the event of death of the president. We learned how the South was so desperate to maintain its independence that it actually was willing to scrap slavery to maintain its independence. And we saw how at war's end, the hatred between the two sides were as great, if not greater, than ever before. We saw how there were these terrible tensions, and there's this potentially terrible drift for vengeance and revenge on one hand, and for revenge and guerrilla war on the other. But none of this happened. None of this happened, and that's what we also learned in this course. In the end, what we saw on the road to April 1865, we saw that the story of April 1865, in effect, is the story of 1 month. We saw that April 1865 is the story of how America went from being a loose confederation of states to becoming, finally at long last, one nation. We saw that April 1865 is probably the most important month in this nation's history, and that had things gone differently in just one small way, in one small fell swoop, this nation could have become very different. It could have devolved and become like these Northern Irelands and these Balkans, or the Cambodias, or the Middle East of the world. And then in the end, what we also saw that April 1865 is a story of character. And finally, we saw that April 1865 is a story of leadership. And most of all, we saw that in the end, April 1865 was a story not just of war, but it was a story of peace. That's the story of April 1865. It's been good sharing it with you.
Now that you've completed this course, be sure to test your comprehension by taking the final exam. You'll find the exam on this course's webpage at www.modernscholar.com. If you enjoyed this program, the Modern Scholar series from Recorded Books offers courses in a variety of subject areas taught by the world's greatest professors. Call 1-800-636-3399 or visit the Modern Scholar webpage for a free catalog. This course, produced by John J. Alexander, is copyrighted 2003 by Recorded Books, LLC. The lecture text is copyrighted 2003 by Jay Winik. The lectures were recorded under the direction of Matthew Kavner.